So good afternoon. My name is just afternoon, I think, yeah. My name is Tim Ward, CEO and co-founder of Think Cybersecurity. And what I want to talk to you about this afternoon is how we need to adapt our approaches to security awareness to apply what we now understand about behavioural science. So in many ways, I hope this follows on from Jess's talk and digs a little bit deeper into, well, let's take that understanding and what can we do to change the way we deliver security awareness to really empower people to protect themselves against cyber threats. So on balance, organisations reacted really well to COVID and the pandemic and having to send everybody home. But we had quite a difficult changed threat landscape. So we had people using new tools they weren't familiar with, Zoom, Teams. We had people working from home who perhaps had never worked from home before. So some of us have had that luxury, but certain people in maybe finance, accounts teams wouldn't have done that much before. Suddenly these whole teams were sent home. We had people really not sure in some places how to share data, people emailing them to their personal accounts so they could print things out. You've got considerations of home Wi-Fi. Is Alexa listening to you? And I think few of us would have thought back in 2019 that people's security awareness training should have considered thinking about whether you're being overheard by someone out the window or when you're sat in the garden, as we were in the first lockdown in the sunshine. And really, security awareness, in the way it was currently designed, wasn't designed to cope with that. And nor really was it an appropriate mechanism, given the competition we had for attention. So we're trying to get to grips with new ways of working, new tools. We've got home distractions from working at home. We've got the constant nag of the news, which at that time, if you remember back in the beginning of 2020, was quite disturbing. Is that really an appropriate time to send someone a half-hour e-learning course on how to act securely at home? Well, you could do that, but would anyone pay attention to it? And then we've got the double whammy here, in that context has changed. And why is context important? Well, we've actually used context in the world of security awareness for a while. It's quite a helpful tool. So you might put posters up, you might have video screens around the office, maybe even mouse mats. And these are useful tools to help remind people to act securely. And actually context works in quite a powerful way when you're in a work environment. So you're sat at your desk, you stand up, you look around, you see a room full of people, that might make you lock your screen. Or perhaps when you're having a phone call and it starts to get a bit sensitive, you see other people around you and you think, maybe I should get a room. Or if you're sat next to someone and you get a suspicious email, you can turn and ask them for help. Even the office environment makes us act that little bit more professionally and think about what we're doing. But all of these cues were gone. So we need to think about how we can adapt security awareness. Increasingly, I think we realize that your annual course that's lasting an hour or so once a year is not really going to be good enough. We need to find ways to grab attention. Increasingly, think about how we can drip feed that, win the competition for attention, deliver tiny snippets, and help empower people to protect themselves as they go about their day. Content creation cycles need to be more like hours and days rather than weeks and months, because we need to be able to react to things that are going on. And we also need to think about context. We need to replace these visual cues when people are working at home. And ideally, we want to give people cues as they go about using their day-to-day IT. So if we can get as close as possible to the context where people are making decisions and help and steer their behaviours, then we really can empower people. So we want the right content at the right time. So it's worth stepping back a little bit and thinking about what are we trying to achieve from awareness. Now, is this about compliance? Well, yes, that is an important thing. Most of us have regulatory requirements. We need to show that people are getting their awareness training. But it's got to be more than that. Is it about expertise? I would argue it's not necessarily about expertise at all. So there's some examples of famous social engineers, experts. I think Chris Hadnagi, an expert social engineer. This guy knows what phishing looks like. He does it quite a lot to other people. He openly admits that he fell for a phishing test. He was expecting a parcel and he was busy. And so here you've got an expert who knows all about phishing, and yet he fell for a phishing test. It's not about knowledge or expertise. Is it about awareness? Well, yes, it is about awareness, but it needs to be more than that. Really, it's about behavioural change. Awareness is just the first step on the path to help people, but we want to be able to engage people, change their behavior, and then sustain that. It's worth a little bit of an aside, and I hesitate necessarily to call these guys the good guys, but they have demonstrated that you can steer and influence people's behavior while they're using their IT. Now, they might use it to get us to stay on their products, perhaps to show us more adverts, but actually there's lots of examples where the behavioral science can be used for good and can help us engage people. Applying nudge theory, it's being used within the pandemic to steer people to get vaccines, which has been used prior to that to help get people to sign up for donor cards. And this is all about helping people to make decisions that are essentially in their best interest. So what if we could create a more people-centric future for security, where, for start, people come to work to focus on their jobs? Now, that should slightly go without saying, but I think sometimes as security practitioners, we forget that other people aren't there thinking about security all the time. That's really not why they've come to work. They're trying to make money for the business. So we need to leave them to focus on their job for most of the time. And to do that, we need to make security really easy to act securely. We need to help people understand why they need to. But really importantly, and this is part of the behavioral models behind this, they need some sort of cues and triggers to help them. And I'll come on to the models behind this shortly, but every behavior is driven by some sort of trigger to act. And then behind the scenes, we want to help the security team. We want you to be able to see what's going on within the organization, who's engaging with what content, and more importantly, what risky behaviors are actually taking place. And if we can understand that and work in this way, then we really should be able to start to drive secure behavior change. And we're not the only ones thinking in this way. So there's lots of organizations out there, particularly sort of banks, insurance, starting to change the names of their security awareness teams. This is moving away from being a learning and development thing to being about culture, engagement. So what I want to explore now is what are the theories behind this, and what are the tools that we could use to help us? So behavioral science models, what are they? Well, they are models built by scientists through research to help us understand how people make decisions. They can help us predict and explain why people make decisions the way they do. And they play to understanding of the cognitive biases. And they give us a really good starting point to work out how we're actually going to deliver awareness that's going to work, that's really going to change behaviors. Now, they obviously have to come with a bit of a warning. They are not precise models. You can't say, if I do this, a human will do that. That's not really the way we work. We're less than rational beings. But they do give us a starting point and help us think about, in general, if we work in this way, we're more likely to get engagement. So we can tailor our awareness in that way. So I want to walk you through 4 models that, and then we can talk about, well, how do we actually apply that to the world of security awareness to see behavior change? So firstly, a really important one, as I've talked about, behavior takes place in context. So Stern suggested that behavior is an interaction of our attitudes, how we think we're going to act, how we believe we're going to act, and what we believe in, and the context that we're in. And what he found was quite interesting, and he found that there was a strong link between your attitude, what you think you're going to do, what you say you're going to do, and how you behaved, when context wasn't really playing much part. But the moment context starts to interfere, the moment it gets a little bit more difficult to act in a particular way, then he found virtually no link between people's attitudes. So whilst they might say they would act in a particular way, when it got serious, when the context was steering them in a different direction, that wasn't actually the way they acted. And so we need to think really hard about how we can help people in this context. How can we change the context potentially to make it easier for people to act securely? The next model I want to look at is protection motivation theory. So this says that when you're faced with a threat, you make 2 assessments of the threat to decide how you're going to respond to it. The first is a threat appraisal, and the second is an appraisal, a coping appraisal. Can I cope with it? And when we say we make these 2 assessments, as Jess talked about earlier, that's going to be across these 2 modes of our thinking. System 1, where we're thinking really reactively and we just react to the situation, and system 2, where we're a bit more deliberative. So we're not necessarily going to stop and think and make these assessments, but that's going to happen across these 2 modes of thought. So the threat appraisal is made up of 2 questions. Think of it a bit like a risk assessment. What's the impact and what's the likelihood of this thing happening? And then the coping appraisal is similarly 2 questions. Can I cope with this? do I know what to do to respond? But also, how much effort is it going to be? What's the cost going to be to me? And what's really interesting is that the research has shown that it's this third point of, do I know what to do? Can I cope? Is there something I should do that is most linked to the way that we decide to protect ourselves? So as Pam Briggs from Northumbria University says, we need to focus a little bit less on scaring people, and a little bit more on giving them the tools to cope. So now I want to look at two models side by side because there are some similarities in the way they explore this. And the first is from Stanford professor B.J. Fogg. And he says that for any behavior to happen, there are three elements. The first is motivation. Do I want to do this? Is it something that I feel I want to do? And motivation can be things like fear, pleasure, pain. And obviously, this is what the bad guys are using with phishing attacks quite often. So they're playing to authority, urgency, fear, desire. And that's what motivates us to potentially click that link. Then Fogg says another element is ability. Do I know what to do? Can I do this thing? And how easy is it for me to do? But thirdly, and really importantly, is some element of prompt, some sort of trigger that makes us actually act. And this is quite important because that means that a change isn't going to happen, a behavior is not going to happen unless there's some sort of prompt to make us do something. The next model comes out of the behavioral insights team, or known as the nudge unit. So this was part of the Cabinet Office. And they came up with 4 elements of an effective nudge, a nudge being a way of steering people to do something that's essentially in their best interests. And they came up with the EAST model. So they talked about making it easy for people to do something. So your nudge should play to that element of ease. Obviously, this relates to ability in Fogg's model. Then they talked about making it attractive, make the thing you want someone to do attractive. And obviously, this relates to motivation. I'll skip over social and come back to it. And they also highlight timeliness. So like the prompt, trying to nudge people at an opportune moment and exactly when you nudge is really going to have a major impact on how effective you are. The thing that they draw out that perhaps Fogg doesn't touch on, although it's an element of motivation, is this social thing. So we're social animals, and a really good way of getting people to act in a particular way is to tell them that everyone else is doing it. So, and the more specific that can be, the better. I think the most famous example of this research was people washing their towels in a hotel room, and it was very effective if you said other people in the hotel reuse their towels. But if you said other people who've stayed in this room reuse their towels, then you got an even stronger effect. So play to that element of social in the content. So I'll just go a little bit further into some of these with a few more insights, and then start to think about, well, how do you actually apply this? What's it really look like if you apply it to the world of awareness? So some more insights from Fogg. What he highlights here in a picture that hasn't come out very well is a relationship between motivation and ability. Essentially, it's a graph, and what he's saying is that if you're really able to do something, if it's really easy, then you don't really need that much motivation potentially. Or if something's really, really hard, then you're going to need a lot of motivation to make you do it. And we can do things that are really difficult if we've got a lot of motivation. And so it's worth reflecting on where security behaviours sit on this line. And unfortunately, they probably sit about here, where people aren't particularly motivated. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't want to act securely, but the point is that it's not their priority. They've got other things and other motivations that are driving them when they're at work on a day-to-day basis. So if that's the case, if people aren't very motivated, then actually we need to make things really easy if we're going to trip them over this line with a prompt to get them to act in a secure manner. What Fogg also says, which is quite interesting, is that order matters here. So we quite often focus very much on motivation. And as Jess talked about earlier, we focus on fear as a way of motivating people. But motivation is actually a really bad place to start. So you can reflect on the fact that if all we needed was to want to do something, we would all be incredibly fit, none of us would smoke, and you wouldn't really need the fitness industry. But it's more than motivation. There are other motivations that compete with those motivations. And so motivation is really quite a complicated lever to try and use to get people to act in a particular way. Yes, security is trying to motivate you to do this, but your boss is trying to motivate you to get that report finished. So how do those things play out? Don't necessarily start with motivation. Really, we should try and start with the prompt. Start with the simplest thing. If you could try and nudge people or prompt them to act in a secure way, and you get the behavior you want, you don't even need to worry about motivation or ease. If the prompt isn't enough, then maybe start thinking about how do we make this easier? And then finally, you might need all three. Let's think about motivation. But don't necessarily try and start with motivation. I'm not entirely sure what's gone wrong with my diagrams, but I'll see if I can make this make sense. So what this is meant to show is a big box found the outside saying context. And what we've talked about is the fact that decisions take place in context. And so here we are, we're making a decision. There's some sort of trigger that's going to drive that decision, and that makes us act. And so if we want to help people in this situation, then there's two ways that we can do this. One is we can look to be interfering between the trigger and the action and say, look, instead of that trigger that you've just had, that urgent email and that link you want to click, let's interfere. Let's be a different trigger to steer you not to do that. Or perhaps we can be the trigger. We can be the trigger that makes you act in a different way, in a secure way. So can we get into that context, replace those cues, and actually steer people whilst they're using their IT? So a quick summary of these key points, and then we'll start looking at, well, how do you actually apply this to the world of security awareness? Really importantly, behavior takes place in context. So that's where we've got to try and help people. We need to think about making things easy, actionable advice, help people with their coping strategy. And so it can be a really simple thing you're telling people to do that then makes them feel that they've got self-efficacy, they feel able to cope with this. And what Fogg talks about in his Tiny Habits book is this idea of working down this line over time that says, right, start with really simple, easy behaviors. And once people feel that they can do that, they get a sense of self-efficacy, and then you can start to make more difficult behaviors. And of course, we should assume motivation's low, and that's why we've got to do things and make them easy. Social proof is really, really helpful. It's a great tool to use. So you can say things like 80% of your colleagues reported phishing emails. Have you reported any? And that really helps to highlight, A, that this is a thing, but also that other people are doing the right thing. And so that will encourage people. And timeliness is really key. Behavior change, behaviors don't happen without some sort of prompt. And this is particularly where we focus on how do we help people at that point of risk. And sadly, annual or quarterly awareness is not timely. It's not going to be that timely prompt. We've all done those sorts of courses, but actually you then get back to your desk and that stuff is quickly forgotten. So what does this look like? How do you apply this? So a good example to start with would be email, safe email use. Some simple behaviors here. You want people to think before they click. You want them to report suspicious emails. So what does it look like if we try and work through these models applied in this context? Well, as Fogg said, let's start with the prompt. Let's look at how we can nudge people to act in a secure way. And timeliness is the most important thing when it comes to a prompt. Really, we're looking for the opportune moment, and that opportune moment is while you're using your email. That's when you need to know and be reminded to be secure. So having a clearly visible reporting button is quite a good prompt in its own right. You have to be a bit careful because you will habituate to that. It will just become one of those other buttons on the ribbon that you no longer see after a couple of months. But really the message here for the prompt is you're in email, think about phishing. Are you sure you want to click this link? Is this safe? Then we need to think about ability. So in the advice we're giving people, we need to make it really easy to remember. So I would say don't try and overcomplicate it. You don't necessarily need everyone to be an expert on spotting every type of phishing. You need them to have a healthy level of skepticism. And if they're not sure, ask someone, report it. And then make that really easy to do, make it easy for them to act. So if it doesn't feel right, report it and give them a mechanism for doing that. And then we need to think about motivation, help them with their threat appraisal. So highlight perhaps that phishing is a real thing and it's really happening. So it's quite interesting that in quite a lot of our organizations, the main phishing emails that people see or get are the ones coming from us testing them because our tools are pretty good at blocking things. And that started to get people thinking that phishing doesn't happen. We did a webinar recently with Vodafone and they'd done a sort of a focus group and they found that 25% of this group had said, no, we don't get phishing emails. I've never had one. they all get blocked by the tools. And they knew for a fact that those people had had one because they just sent them one. And so people have this, it plays to what Jess talked about earlier, this optimism bias. It's not happening to us, we're safe. And so you can help people by highlighting, well, how many phishing emails have got blocked by the team? Yeah, we're doing our part, so there's an element of social proof, but how many are getting through? And show them real examples. And that social proof goes to highlight, yes, phishing happens, but it also highlights other people reporting. So the CEO reported this one, or Fred in accounts spotted this one. And that makes people think, well, maybe I should too. So what could that look like? Well, one thing we do with red flags is we want to nudge people from time to time when they're in their email. So for example, this is an email from someone that I've never had an email from before. So it's someone that's potentially slightly riskier. Maybe as I'm about to click the link, a little nudge to say, before you click, check the sender. You wouldn't want this on all the time, and you would want to reduce it. So you would start to learn and say, right, we're not going to nudge on that email address now again for a while. But really, you're just trying to knock people out of system 1 into system 2. Another approach, rather than the button, we take the approach of doing something that hovers over your Outlook window. And what that means is that when you get to Outlook, there's a slight delay, it flicks into appearance, and that movement catches your attention. And also, we can change what this looks like. So every 3 to 6 months, you change the logo, you change the text. And so it avoids that issue of habituation. And the simple idea here is you can drag and drop to report something. But then we could get a bit more educational. So maybe just once a month, when people are using their email, a gentle nudge saying something about phishing. This one says, do you know about phishing? Click to find out more. But this is a great place to use that social proof and say, Fred in accounts reported this phishing email. Have you spotted any? And then when people engage with it, show them a real example. Very quick, it's going to take you 20, 30 seconds to look at this, but you've been reminded about phishing, and then you get on with your job. So let's go back to the models and look at, well, how do you just more generally engage people? So first, we need to think about the prompt. Timeliness is really important, and I've talked already about this idea that you really ought to be trying to drip feed your awareness rather than doing it once a year or even quarterly. Keep it ongoing, and when you're doing that, it's actually a real opportunity because you can make it topical. You can use things that are happening in the news. People engage much more strongly with things that are relevant to them and they're topical. Sadly, annual awareness is not very timely. Then make it easy. So make it really easy for people to digest the content. Break down the barriers. So you don't want people having to go somewhere else, log into a tool, click 10 times to find the course you want them to do. That's just going to put people off. You need to make it really easy to consume the content as well, and give them an element of choice as to how and when they consume it. And then in the advice you're giving, that's where ease also comes in. Make it really simple advice that you're trying to tell people to do. And then again, motivation, help them with their threat appraisal. As I've said, using personal context, helping people understand why some of these threats will impact them in their home lives. And then those security behaviors will rub off at work as well. As Jess said earlier today, in fact, as well, if you want people to do something, then try and set it in a positive frame. If you want to move people away from a behavior, then yes, you can highlight the threat and the risk to them, and fear of loss is quite important there. But if you want people to do a different thing, you need to set that in a positive way. And you can exploit curiosity as well, so in that motivation, so using stories and things like that. What could that look like? Well, the approach we take with red flags is we actually bring the content straight to the user. So it appears in the background on their desktop as a story that's going to take them maybe 50 seconds to cycle through. So they get an element of choice of when they engage with it. And because it appears and it's going to sit there for maybe a week until the next piece of content comes along, we find that people do engage with it. So we get 80 to 90% engagement straight out of the box with this sort of content. Whereas if you send out an email saying, go and do your e-learning, you're probably going to get 10 to 15. And then the whole cottage industry starts of chasing people to go and do their awareness training. So what about more generally, how do we prompt people? How do we help them at that point of risk? We want to give some sort of real-time in-context guidance, think about the prompt, make it really easy, and then motivate people. So a simple example here, maybe when you go to a certain web page, Dropbox in this example, we change the cursor to say, don't use this for corporate information or something like that. Exactly how you nudge you can change. So you trigger off this event that says, right, they've gone to this particular website. What do we want to show them? Do we want quite a subtle cursor that changes? Do we want to actually put a box on the screen with a bit more information and steer people towards the behavior you actually want them to do instead? We could also wait and say, well, look, it's fine to be on the Dropbox page. What we care about is if you actually upload a document. So at the point you click add file, that's when we might want to nudge and say, instead of using this, use this secure tool instead. Quite a common data breach. I think MOD experienced this about a couple of months ago, sending an email to 250 people and they put all the names in the to box. Happens all the time. It's so simple to nudge against something like this. So you spot that there's too many emails in there and deliver a little message that says, should you be using BCC instead? Another example that could be because your company policy says don't sign up on websites with your company email address, or this could be part of a phishing attack. So if I put my email address into this browser, then a little nudge that says, are you actually using this for corporate purposes? So if it is your company policy, you don't want people signing up with their corporate email address, that is a very hard policy to police. You just have to tell people and hope they do it. In this case, you could actually nudge them when they do it. And obviously behind the scenes, you're getting data on who is doing this, how often is it happening, and you can hopefully see that behavior change over time. More examples with emails, so maybe addressing an email to a webmail address, you might want to nudge people when they do that, or you might want to nudge people when they're adding attachments. If it's internal, you might want to steer them towards using a SharePoint link instead, or if it's external, you might really just want them to double check they've got the right people. And a final example, nudging people when they use social media. It's just another website in some respects, but it's a different message here. Take care what you share on social media. Or you might want to use this to highlight that actually phishing happens in LinkedIn messages just as much as in email. There are other threats, there are other ways to apply threats. So in essence, what I'm trying to say is that traditional approaches really aren't enough. They've been slow to adapt to the pandemic and to the messages that we need to send people, but actually they're not particularly in tune with the way people actually behave and use their devices. They're not always this bad, but they are quite often infrequent, overly complex, too compliance-based, boring or patronizing. And there was some research by the information ISF, forgotten what that stands for, Information Security Forum, a few years ago that said that only 15% of people actually changed their behavior. Forrester did some more interesting research recently where they asked quite a sneaky question, which was which came out that 40% of people said that their colleagues didn't apply the secure behaviors they were being taught, which I think is quite a good proxy measure of whether people were really answering for their colleagues or were they answering for themselves. But 40% of people not actually doing the behaviors that they're learning in their security awareness training. I could talk for hours about fish test train and whether that's a good idea or not. I think you have to be a little bit careful with it. NCSC have obviously been urging some caution in the way that we use this so that your staff don't feel tricked and embarrassed, because that can actually damage your security culture and get people wanting to sweep things under the carpet, and you need them to be telling you about things. So what's our approach? It's about taking a real-time approach, looking at how you can help people in context and steer them at the point of risk. It's about keeping things ongoing, drip-fed throughout the year in what I call low-impact chunks, in that you want to leave people to get on with their jobs. So you need to just get in there, tell them a little snippet of security awareness, and then they get back to their work. But then keep that content engaging over time, real examples, and make it relevant to their personal lives. And once you're delivering that content, this is where you can start to play in social proof and other cognitive biases to make people really engage. So some very final observations, and I've said it probably 3-4 times already. Behavior takes place in context. We've got to think about how we help people in context. They've left the training room, they've left the e-learning, they're back at their desk, they're getting on with their job. That's where we need to help them. Change is going to require thinking about some sort of prompt, people's ability and motivation. And as Fogg says, try and think of it in this order because it makes your life easier. If you can just prompt people, you don't need to worry about the other two. Annual quarterly awareness is clearly not very timely. But the models have also talked us about this idea of ease being important, using social proof, and this focus on helping people cope. And we now realize that we need rapid content cycles to adapt to a changing context. And as I said, this is a real opportunity because we can react to things happening in the news. We can even react to an incident taking place within our organization and turn that into next week's awareness. fundamentally, if you want to do this and change the way people behave, you need a way of getting into the context and steering them. And that's what we do with red flags. So very happy to take questions if we've got time, possibly not. But please do visit us on the stand upstairs if you want to talk more or find out more about our approach.